many people my age at the time of 1945 had the same experiences as ether causes bleeding after the surgery. And that's what my condition was. One thing I do remember when I got back was that my uncle had told me what was going to happen in like people would be walking on the moon, but my father was very worried about me telling my mother that this happened, that I had, met my uncle Neal about a year after he had died in the accident. And so I never spoke about it until 1940 or 1995 when I met PMH Atwater. But I believe that our spirit dream is actually the tangible human experience that we're having now is a part of our spiritual dream in order to remember what our spiritual life is like. And we're in a kind of a dream state as a human in order to remember the spiritual aspects of our lives.
The A.J. Parr Spiritual Journalist Podcast.
Today I'm with a very special guest, Anthony Chipoletti. He had a near-death experience when he was only 7 years old. So welcome, Anthony. How are you?
Thank you, AJ. I'm doing very well.
What made you face this near-death experience?
I probably had a lot of allergies because I still have them. And they did these, many people my age at the time of 1945 had the same experiences as ether causes bleeding after the surgery. And that's what my condition was. And apparently my father was driving me to the hospital in his car. When PMH Atwater wrote the book Children of the New Millennium, she had many people in there with almost the same scenario. At the time, they thought this tonsil removal would cure the allergic responses. I only remember what my father told me about it and that one vision where when the NDE ended, but I can't remember anything before that or after that as an active memory. It's only what my father told me about what happened in the car and after the surgery. My last memory actually before the NDE was when my uncle left to go to Europe. And that I remember him in uniform, and I believe I was crying and saying he shouldn't go because he wouldn't come back. And I remember my mother and he were there before he left for the last time. And so I had aspects of the near-death experiences before that particular near-death experience. One thing I do remember when I got back was that my uncle had told me what was going to happen in like people would be walking on the moon. That's the only thing I recall, and it isn't a visual memory. It's just an auditory memory. But as everyone says in their NDE, it was not a sound and not a living speaking sound. It was just a telepathic message. But my father was very worried about me telling my mother that this happened, that I had, met my uncle Neal about a year after he had died in the accident. And so I never spoke about it until 1940 or 1995 when I met PMH Atwater. But during the time between 1945 and 1995, I didn't even know what a near-death experience was or the term. I believe my father probably told me not to tell my mother because she had a very high anxiety about her life. When she was a child, about 6 years old, someone burned down their home. They were sort of squatting on some public land, and somebody that was never identified burned down their home while they were still in it. And they barely escaped with their lives. So she had, from the age 6 years on, she had terrible anxiety. And I'm pretty sure my father told me never to mention anything about my near-death experience to my mother, which meant I would not tell anybody because at that time I was like 6 or 7. There was no one else I would confide in except my father and my mother. I had very similar similar events. Like I, I could tell if people were being hurt somewhere. Like I remember seeing a vision of myself walking into the gas chambers in the German death camps. I remember that as a part of something like lucid dreaming. It would happen to me way before my near-death experience. So I already had a spiritual aspect to my life, which didn't understand as a child. I thought everyone had that. And it still happens every once in a while. About 3 years ago, there was a mass shooting at a Pittsburgh synagogue, and I knew something terrible was happening, but I didn't know what it was exactly. It was about 20 miles from where I was at. I was in my home, and I had no knowledge of what was happening there, but I had many similar experiences like that after my near-death event. When I was still a child, I could find information that, or find something, say we were playing baseball and the ball got lost in a 6 foot tall grass somewhere, and I would just walk right up to it and say, "Here it is." And it was like I could see the event in my mind, as most people say when they went up to the ceiling and they could see, and they traveled like over some part of the land or somewhere. But I'd never had the visual portion, that I only had the end result. I could tell where things were, or I could find some way to uh, find something that no one else knew where it was. In fact, PMA Chatwater told me she feels that everyone has an aspect of the near-death experiences that we know of now probably happens to everyone at birth, because it's such a traumatic experience to be born. And she also said that all of the things that happen in an NDE that we know of now can happen in everyday life without any near-death experience. We only have to understand when they have these continuums that we can change. We can identify ourselves freely as whoever we believe we are, a human, a spirit, whatever we believe we can identify ourselves. And we also can identify our experiences as being, spiritual or physical. Or many people that I talk with, they don't want any spiritual aspect to their life because they're not comfortable.
You were included in PMH Atwater's book, right?
Yes, Children of the New Millennium. I invited her to speak in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania in 1994, about 6 months after my mother died, because I found her book, Beyond the Light. And that was the first time I realized what a near-death experience was. So I invited her. She came and gave a seminar, mostly to people. Well, the personal seminar that she gave was with about 6 or 7 people who were working as nurses or doctors in, with patients who had near-death experiences, who often, needed their help in understanding that they were going to die. So she gave two two sessions, one with this 7 or 8 people who were, dealing with near death almost every day, and then she gave a public one, which about 30 people came. But she did include me in her book, and gave me a lot of information before she arrived and after she arrived. In 1995, before PMH Atwater came to Pittsburgh, she gave me Nancy Clark's phone number, and Nancy and I talked on the phone for about a half an hour. When I hung up the phone, this was about 6 months after my mother died. When I hung up the phone with Nancy, the room that I was in filled up completely with a golden light. I didn't know what it was, and I didn't realize that it was my mother until after I talked with PMH Atwater. I asked her if she told Nancy Clark what happened after our call, And she said, no, because everyone who talks to Nancy has that happen to them. They see some type of light. She wrote a book about the near or the whatever those experiences were with her being able to give people an out of body or an after death experience. Her book is still on Amazon, but her website just now recently went offline. So I'm not sure if she died or whatever, but I have, I sent you her new website, her website address on the Internet Archives. The Internet Archives has her website as it used to be, but her current website isn't there anymore. So that was the most profound experience that I could relate to any after death experience. That was, I believe, it was just solely on the power of Nancy's, phone call, because I had never met her and I had still not met PMH Atwater in person. So that was the first really profound after death experience I had. And then about a year or so later, I was doing a Native American ritual because where we lived in near Pittsburgh, PA, there was uh, about a week or 9 days of drought with no rain. So I was going to do this ritual as so it was PMH Atwater who told me about the ritual, but I'm not sure where I got the ritual exactly. But when I was doing it, my grandson, who had died at birth about 3 months before, I felt his presence and saw a star up in the sky. The whole sky was pink and blue, like it was a blanket of some kind that you couldn't see anything except that pink and blue. And directly above my head was a bright star, and I believed that was him. But I leaned backward, and I felt like somebody was lifting me up from my back, like a giant hand was holding me back. And I looked back across the street from where I was standing, and there was another star behind the tree. And that, I believe, was his brother who died in a miscarriage about 10 years after that event. So what I now believe is that humans are seeing time in reverse. Our spirits are actually dreaming that we're human. So when we look at something as human being in the future, it's actually in the past. We're just remembering our spiritual experiences as human. But the human experience is something like a dream that our spirit is having. When my father's father died, I was on my way back to my hometown where he had been in the hospital with my aunt. And a, I was traveling about 35 miles an hour, which was the speed limit, and a huge white bird came right down and grabbed my windshield wiper on my driver's side. And I thought, oh my God, I'm going to kill this bird. The bird just left the windshield wiper and flew away. And I said my grandfather died at that moment, and he did. I believe we are always in the perfect and complete presence of the Spirit of God. I call it the divine source because the word God has too many meanings to too many people. But I believe we're in the divine presence as a spirit all the time. And we experience that as an infinite set of experiences, which are impossible to remember because they're eternal. We've been there for eternity. Our human life is an aspect of our spiritual life, which adds a memory of some kind. When we remember something as a human, it's part of what our spirit has already experienced. But in the spiritual presence, there's no memory because it's eternal and infinite. There's too much there to remember. When we have a human dream, our human dream is there to remember yesterday, 24 hours yesterday, and plan for tomorrow for 24 hours. So it's just a short-term memory as human while human dreaming. But I believe that our spirit dream is actually the tangible human experience that we're having now is a part of our spiritual dream in order to remember what our spiritual life is like. My belief is that we're always in the spiritual presence, the divine presence that's fully present. We're never away from it in any way. And what our human experience is, why it's so scary and difficult, is because it's trying to establish a memory of our spiritual experience. And that's the main thing I would say is we're never away from the divine presence. We're never away from the people we love who love us. Our spiritual presence is always the true reality, and it is what we actually experience. And we're in a kind of a dream state as a human in order to remember the spiritual aspects of our lives. People need to have a peaceful and safe and happy life.
This has been the A.J. Parr Spiritual Journalist Podcast. Please like, share, and subscribe.